preacher's son, and when his daddy would visit, he'd come along. When they gathered around and started talking, Cousin Billy would take me walking. Out through the backyard we go walking. Then he looked into my eyes. Lord knows to my surprise, the only one who could ever reach me was the son of a preacher man. The only boy who could ever teach me was the son of a preacher man. Yes, he was. He was. Yes, he was. Being good isn't always easy, no matter how hard I try. When he started sweet talking to me, he'd come and tell me everything is alright.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Al Bond. I'm the executive director here at the Avalon Foundation. I want to welcome you all here to the Avalon Theater this evening. Ordinarily, I tell you about the upcoming shows, but you probably saw them on our video wall, so I'm not going to talk about that. What I am going to say is this Spy series is a great partnership between the Avalon and the Talbot Spy, which would not have been possible were it not for the Stoltz Listening Room. The Stoltz Listening Room is turning 15 this year, just did in September. And that is a place where we can do things that we would not choose to do in the theater normally. And we're in the theater because this was a great success and we had more people that wanted to be here than would fit in the Stoltz Listening Room. But we would not have taken the risk on a series like the Spy series, if we did not have that space. So it is a gift that gives back to the community over and over and over again, and celebrate. It's 15. So with that said, Dave Whelan, who is the mastermind behind the Spy, came with a great idea that we should be celebrating more literature in our community, and that's sort of the beginning point. There are two more in the Spy series, so if you enjoy yourself this evening, I encourage you to come back both in November and December for the last two. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to Dave, and please give a very warm welcome to Al Fromm and Craig Fuller.
I'm tempted to say, it's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Thank you for coming to, I think, our sixth Spy night at the Avalon, and it just makes me want to thank the Avalon Foundation so much for this collaboration. We do Spy nights, but we also do a lot of public affairs programming. I think we've now done 4 election town hall meetings, and I think it's just been a terrific partnership. And so I think we're going on 2 years now. But the last one we did was the school board election, and our own Craig Fuller was the moderator for that. So just terrific involvement. And I can't help but thank Al Fromm and Craig Fuller. This is the 4th year these guys have been doing this. It's amazing to volunteer for this kind of project for such a long time. Every week, rain or shine, regardless of what continent you're on, we make it. And so these guys really don't deserve a long introduction. They are just some of the most remarkable political analysts I've ever heard, and I think many people here agree with that. So we'll get into it, and I think many of you might have noticed that we did a spy survey over the last week about our Senate race in Maryland between Larry Hogan and Mrs. Alsbrook, and it's competitive. And in the spy survey, Craig has been looking at the numbers. I mean, it was almost 2-to-1 in favor of Alsbrook. And I think on statewide level, we're looking at from 7 to 10% gap with Alsbrook in the lead. So this is kind of a remarkable moment in politics in Maryland. Larry Hogan was very popular, still is popular, but it looks like, at least in Maryland, it's going to go blue. I'm going to start with Al Fromm, if you wouldn't mind, and give us your sense of this race and your predictions.
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's always good for me. I live in Annapolis, so it's good for me to come over to Easton and the Eastern Shore, see how the better half lives, I guess. Look, this race, Larry Hogan is a very popular governor. He ended his gubernatorial term with approval ratings in the 70s, and with higher approval ratings among Democrats than Republicans. So, and if you watch his ads, you wouldn't know that he was a Republican. But the problem Larry Hogan has is that he's a Republican, and with the Senate teetering on the balance, it's really 50-50, because what Joe mentioned, retiring in West Virginia, and a Republican going to take that seat, it'll be 50-50. With control of the Senate, basically depending on each seat, I think that basically is going to be the reason that Hogan will not be able to make up an enormous amount of ground. Essentially, two things are happening. One is with Kamala Harris in the race, she's going to win the state by 30 points. Biden won it by 33 points last time. And it's just too much to make up, to try to make up a 30-point deficit. Even if he is popular, he's absolutely going to put a lot of money in it, into the race. But I saw an internal Republican memo which referred to the poll as that Dave referred to it with 7%. I think public polls have it more in low double digits. But it was enough that this wasn't going to be even a particularly high priority race for the Republicans. So I think there are two things that are really affecting the race. One, he's a Republican, and the best argument also Brooks has is we got to keep the Senate Democratic. And because of abortion and other issues that are dominating the TV ads, that's a really important thing. And the other thing is that Joe Biden dropped out, and instead of having a 15-point Maryland victory for the Democrats, it's going to be Kamala Harris with a 30-point victory, and that just is going to be too much for Larry Hogan to overcome, in my view.
Greg, what's your take? I mean, that spread is pretty big.
There's no question about that. First, let me say I think it's important to say that Dave and I love doing these surveys. The responses we get, I call them it's a survey of the willing. In other words, it's not a scientifically conducted random survey of all the people that live in Talbot County. But it does give us a reflection on what the readers are thinking, and I think that's good for us to know. And I think in that sense, it's probably pretty realistic. I mean, usually the Democratic challenger to our own Congressman Andy Harris, the Democratic challenger carries Talbot County. And so the fact that the numbers here were higher, they were a little higher than I would have expected, but it didn't shock me. I do think Republicans did something, it's kind of rare this election year. They actually picked a really good candidate to run. Larry Hogan is probably the ideal candidate in many ways from a Republican standpoint, a popular governor, somebody who's got proven experience, somebody who's had experience, debating and speaking and working with all the different constituencies throughout the state, running against a county executive in a statewide race, and so mathematically it made sense. And Hogan is sufficiently moderate and without the sharp elbows and rough edges to be attractive. And so from the beginning, while the numbers were always going to be a stretch, he has commanded a good deal of money, as we all know by watching television ads, but a good deal of money for this campaign because people thought it was an opportunity. I think the people that do this for a living, not Al and me, but who do this for a living in terms of rating these races, have kind of determined that, as Al was suggesting, Angela Also Brooks has this one in the bag, unless something completely unforeseen happens in the next 20 days. The only thing I would say is that I don't think either candidate has been really exceptional at running their campaigns. The ads are, kind of negative, going after each other. I don't know how many of you watched the debate between Hogan and Also Brooks, but at one point Larry Hogan said, well, I like Angela Also Brooks. I worked with Angela Also Brooks. I thought I was going to endorse her. Couldn't figure out what was going on. She then, by the way, turned on him and was ruthless. But so it's a race where I guess I'm left feeling that Also Brooks would likely win, but I have no idea what kind of senator she'll be. But at this point, I think the Democrats put money in because there is no way they wanted to see this seat go to a Republican. And the other person, actually, there's two other key people. In a recent survey of over 3,000 people nationally, the most favorably viewed individual on the scene today is Obama. And Obama endorsing Also Brooks was a big deal. But for us in Maryland, the other key person, and I think for him, we've talked about this when we first started talking about this race, I didn't know how Also Brooks would do, but I knew that Westmore would not let a Republican win this seat, not only from a partisan standpoint, but because of his own interests down the road. He really has to deliver this state for the Democrat.
Just one other point, that it's more of a generic point. Hogan is trying to move from the governorship into the Senate. And over my career, I've worked with a lot of Democratic governors who have won the governorship in Republican states. The one that comes to mind is Bruce Babbitt in Arizona, and obviously that's a long time ago. And Babbitt always refused to run for the Senate because he says when you move from state to federal office, you pay a penalty. It's sort of a tax for being in Arizona for being a national Democrat. You can be a state Democrat, but when you're a national Democrat, you lose about 10 points of your approval rating. And that works in the opposite way for Hogan in Maryland, which is a Republican state, or which is a Democratic state. Democrats, as I said, had a very high approval rating for him as governor, but when he wants to go on to the Senate, it becomes more ideological, and it means power control of the Senate. For Democrats, there's only one vote that Hogan can say he's going to vote, pro-choice, whatever he wants. But for Democrats, there's only one vote that matters, and that's for majority leader.
Can I add one more thing, too? I think we have more time, so, we'll just run on. You never no idea what's going to happen. The reality is, the question that a candidate begins to ask themselves, and his or her supporters ask, well, if this doesn't work, what's next? If Republicans have a chance to rebuild the party, which, A, they have to do that, B, I hope they have the chance. I think Hogan has a future in that space. I think the fact that he went out and ran, he will be seen as running a responsible campaign. He has a message that I'm sure he will perfect over time. And I do think from the standpoint of Maryland, we have somebody who could continue to be a leader and could continue, and could be somebody who helps rebuild the party.
You know, most of these polls, Al, are showing incredibly at this stage of this campaign, 4% are still undecided. And it looks like this election is going to be highly dependent, whoever wins is going to be highly dependent on that 4% swinging their way. Who are these people and how do you reach them?
If I knew that, I'd go work for one of the campaigns. Who knows? I mean, you can read 10 polls from quality pollsters and get 10 different ideas of who the swing voters are. This is my gut instinct, is that a lot of them are soft Republicans, independent thinking Republicans who don't want to vote for Donald Trump, but haven't been convinced whether to vote for Kamala Harris. Think about what the Lincoln Project, which is all of Craig's old friends in the Republican Party who decided to lead the anti-Trump fight. And, they aimed to get about, 6 or 7% of the electorate last time to vote for Biden against Trump, and they were successful. I think a lot of those people are the same. But, just to give a little context, before I came over here tonight, I just wanted to take a look at the states that matter. I mean, 4%, that's fine. But what really matters is who's going to win in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And Pennsylvania being the keystone of that. And if you look at the national polls, you'll see, on average, Harris running around 3 points ahead. But these state polls are really tight. I mean, they're all within a point, one way or the other. And this doesn't get at to who the undecided are, but the demographics of those blue wall states are really important. Trump's problem everywhere is that he has a ceiling. And it's a little higher in those blue wall states, and this is the reason. Demographically, they are older, whiter. For example, the country as a whole is 2/3 white, the electorate. It's over 80% in all of those blue wall states are white. At least 10% higher non-college white voters in each of those states than nationally. I think the challenge for Harris, Trump's going to get, if you look at the last two races in those swing states, he got about a little over 48%, got basically the same vote exactly in those states in 2016 and 2020. The difference was in 2016, there were third-party candidates that sopped up about 4 or 5% of the vote, took it out of Hillary, and Trump won those states. So what's the formula? For Kamala Harris, Vice President Harris, it's to maximize her advantage among women and college-educated voters, because the educational divide is now the biggest divide in the country, in the electorate, and to cut her losses, even if it's only by 3 or 4 points in those states among non-college white voters. And that's, so if you look at those numbers, you'll really get in how they start to come out as the returns come in, you'll really see who's going to win.
So you can cut this out if you want to of the show tomorrow, but I can't resist. 2 nights ago on this stage, David Sedaris described for us what he thought a undecided voter was. And you were at the show, and I'm going to clean it up though. He said, it's when the flight attendant comes down the aisle and says, "Sir, we have 2 things for dinner tonight. There's this sort of oatmeal mush with shards of glass in it, or there's chicken." And the undecided person looks at her and says, "How's the chicken prepared?" He did a better job. I think, so I've seen some polling that the undecided's a little higher, but I saw a split that suggested that the percentage of undecided voters in the key states, the really close states, is a little higher than nationally. And so I agree with Al. I mean, you have voters out there who really have heard almost everything they're going to hear, but they just haven't locked in, and I think a lot of them are Republicans or people who think they support Trump, but they're just not sure they can go that direction. And this Nikki Haley component, she was getting 20% of the vote when the race was over. But I have a little different take on it, which is there's another decision point in all of this, and that's the actual decision to go vote. And I think that I may be more optimistic about Kamala Harris being able to win this than others, because I think that undecided person, the person who says, do I just really want to go even cast a vote, is going to make a difference for Kamala Harris. Because I think Kamala Harris is campaigning every day. She did a really remarkable speech today in Washington Crossing, Pennsylvania, on kind of our values and democracy and patriotism. And the laugh, was not in it. It was a very stern, very direct set of remarks. But she's giving people reasons to go out and vote for her. So while both sides have their voters who are committed, the question is which of these two people will get their voters out to vote. And I understand people feel that the policies they think Donald Trump might pursue lead them to support him. Whether you agree with that or not, you can't watch him day in and day out campaigning and think he's giving people a reason to go vote for him. I mean, this last event on stage with, something happens, by the way, when you don't have some of the bright lights, but something happens when you're on stage. If somebody actually faints, I'm not suggesting it, usually it happens all the time when you've got a crowd that has been standing in the sun, going through security, warm room, no water, they get dehydrated and they faint. Well, the thing is, they go to the ground and the people on the side can't see what happens, but the speaker can always see what happens. This happened to Tim Walz in August, fairly newly minted vice presidential candidate. And he was up on stage, I don't know if you remember it, but he saw somebody faint. He stops immediately. He was on teleprompter, but he stops immediately. He gets the emergency services people over. He directs the first responders to where the person is standing. Then there's another person who has an issue. He stands there. He tells everybody to drink a lot of water. He's silent, very patient while they take care of all this. This contrasted with Donald Trump, who sees two people go down and plays Ave Maria and YMCA. I think the poor people, if they were revived and woke up and heard Ave Maria and saw him dancing, they would go back again on the ground, I think. I mean, so it is comical in some ways, but think of this. We're in the last 20 days of this election. Every moment counts. You cannot get it back. And which one of these two candidates is giving more people to turn out and vote? So I think in the end, those who decide to go vote for Kamala Harris will outnumber those who were wondering and decide to go vote for Trump.
If you look at people like Nate Cohn of the New York Times, who's one of the best analysts, he talks about a lot of the undecided as like black men, Latinos, and my guess is that those are the people really that Craig's talking about. The choice is not whether they vote for Trump probably, but whether they're going to vote for Harris or sit on the couch. And my guess is that is true. That what Craig said is right. That a lot of those people are going to get out. Every year the polling shows there's a lagging of black votes for the Democratic candidate, and then on election day it's 92%, like it always is. And I suspect that'll be the case this time.
And in that context, it's exactly why Kamala Harris is out doing these podcasts and shows that none of us ever listen to. But here's the thing. the polling shows that only about 30% of Americans today trust the national media. And many of these younger voters, and younger by like in their 40s and 30s, they're not listening, they're not tuned in to the shows we're watching. They're not watching weekend news shows, they're not watching CNN, but they're listening to these podcasts. And she's going out there and reaching an audience, which, by the way, when she does it, reaches not only the audience, but then is also broadcast by CNN and others to everybody else.
Al, when I look at the Trump campaign and the MAGA influence, I actually see a movement. Whether you like it or not, there is this percentage of Americans who will do anything for Donald Trump. Doesn't Vice President Harris need a movement to get over this hump with this election?
Well, I doubt that in the short period she's had as a national candidate, she's going to put together a movement. What she needs to do is consolidate everybody in the country who doesn't want to vote for Donald Trump, because that's more than the majority of the electorate. Trump does have an intense, there's no question about it, he has an intense cult-like following. And it is a movement, but it probably has a ceiling of 47% of the national vote. He got 46.2 in 2016, I think 46.7 or 8 in 2020. And but the challenge is for Harris is to get everybody else and to get them out to the polls. I don't think she's going to try, figure out some magic way to create a movement. Maybe it will be over time. I guess the last time we had a movement candidate was Barack Obama, but he also had 2 years to build his movement, and for the first year of it, Hillary still seemed to be the most likely. Look, I think there's something very fundamental. I agree Trump has a movement, but I think there's something very fundamental that's going on in the country, and it's something we've talked about off and on over the last 4 years, and that is this country is changing. It's changing demographically very dramatically. When Craig and I were doing national politics, in the race we ran against each other in 1992, it was 88% of the electorate was white. In 2020, 67% of the electorate was white. What America is trying to do, and it's tough, and is become the first real diverse democracy, racially, ethnically, religiously, and that's hard. You hear the stories about the Olympics when the Japanese team comes out, they all look like Japanese. When the European teams, they all look like European. African teams, they all look African. And then the Americans come out and they look like every one of them. But that's the point. It's hard because what changing demography means is that power arrangements have to change. And the people who were part of that 88 or 90% when we were in politics had complete control. They're not going to have it anymore. And what Trump is sort of the resistance to that. And, so he has there's no question he has this cult-like support that is really trying to hold back the change. And it might win. We talk about get out the vote. Democrats, and when Craig was in the Republican Party, used to have even better get out the vote drives. They call voters, but now they're not going to call Craig Fuller, because the Trump get out the vote drive is to squeeze more blood out of that non-college educated white turnup. He's betting, and he may be right one or two more times, but it won't be over the long haul. He's betting that there are a bunch of Trump voters, or at least a significant number, of non-college educated whites, which are a decreasing part of the electorate, who still want to hold out, and he can get them to come out and vote for him one more time. That's his get out the vote drive. It's fundamentally different than a normal political get out the vote drive.
You know, Craig, you're the expert on the big mo. Your boss was the proponent of that phrase, but we're also talking about a movement as well, aren't we?
Yeah, I think so. I don't want to keep us till 8 o'clock tonight, but I go back to 2008 and 9, not so much from the politics of the day, but with regard to the economy and the downturn in the economy. And we'd had a number of years, people experienced a number of years of economic growth, jobs, good jobs, that sort of thing. And with the recession that hit and hung around, suddenly people's lives were not going down a path they had foreseen. And there's lots of ways to describe it, where, you know, your children are not going to be as successful as you were, where, you know, businesses were failing, or you didn't have a job, or you knew more and more people who didn't have jobs. And as we came out of that recession, it was very uneven. The person who, either by luck or strategy, took advantage of that was Donald Trump in 2016. And what he tapped into was this sentiment that Washington just doesn't understand me and the problems I'm coping with. That was a view of a lot of Republicans, also some Democrats. But he tapped into it to the point where the other candidates we put up, some, you know, by the name of Bush and some other good ones, were just seemed to be more of the same for this part of the population. And it wasn't like it was 60% of the population. It was probably 28 to 30% of the population, but it was enough to win in primary after primary after primary, and suddenly Donald Trump was the only one standing. And I think the movement is less about him than this sentiment of, my life isn't working out the way I wanted it to. In this large national survey that was taken, the Harris supporters, by over 50%, around 50%, feel that their financial situation is getting better. The Trump supporters, by 60 or 70%, think it's getting worse. Any measure in this survey, any measure of optimism, you find the Harris supporters more optimistic, the Trump supporters more pessimistic. And others have written that education is a big break in this. But and it is, I mean, in terms of, you can see how people with different educational levels vote differently, and the higher educated ones vote for Harris. But I think that's as much about economics as anything else, because the higher educated voters are making more money and prospering more. And those who are in rural areas are having to struggle much longer and much harder to get their lives back on track. And so for them, they look at a character who many of us just can't understand, but they think at least he's going to fight for them, for me and for my family. And that's the base he's built. And really that's, in so many ways, the challenge of both parties. I actually think Harris is doing a pretty good job on the turn the page, this is about hope. But for some, they're just not going to accept that message.
Well, presidential elections are always between change and more of the same. So both candidates want to be the candidate of change. Probably if Harris has made a single big mistake in the campaign, it is when she was on The View and she was asked for differences with Biden, not being able to point to one. I think over the next 3 weeks, you're going to find out that she's very different on a lot of issues than Biden, and she's going to make that clear. Because, look, if this were a normal year, if you had a normal Republican and a generic Democrat, which you could say Harris is a generic Democrat, the Republicans would win. Because Biden's got an approval rating in the low 40s at best. People think the country's going in the wrong direction. It's a perfect formula for wanting change in the country. But, you know, the problem is the kind of change that Trump really suggests. I mean, I don't know what his policies are, except that he's for tariffs, but he doesn't probably even know what a tariff is. But What we do know is that he says he's willing to terminate the Constitution to stay in power, and that he just said last weekend that he'd use the military against his political adversaries. So that's the thing for me that scares me. You know, I know some people who have heard me over the last 4 years say that I think Trump's an existential threat to democracy, and that's why. I mean, my old friend, Republican Jack Kemp, who made the Tidewater famous, used to tell me, you know, look, we're political adversaries. We have different points of view, but we're not enemies. The Russians are our enemies. Well, with Trump, the Russians are our friends, and our political adversaries are our enemies, and that's a dangerous thing for the future of democracy. So I think you're going to hear, one, more change from Biden, and secondly, more emphasis on Trump in this, you know, the direct threat he's posing to democracy. And if you don't believe he'll do it, just remember January 6th. So I think that's what from the Democratic point of view, I think that's where the campaign's going to go.
You know, in the speech today, I don't want you to faint, but in the speech today, Kamala Harris wrapped up by saying how much she believes in America. And she said, America is still that shining city on a hill. Ronald Reagan must have said that 10,000 times, which said to me she is going after that Republican vote that's dissatisfied.
Absolutely. I mean, look, you know, if you listen to Fox or MSNBC, you'll think that the only way you get more votes is to go after the people who already support you. But the reality of winning elections is getting your base out, of course, but it's also cutting your losses among the constituencies that don't naturally support you. Because politics in the end is arithmetic, and you got to get up to 51.
Do you see an October surprise? I mean, it mattered in 2016.
Lord knows what the October surprise is going to be. I mean, we've had surprises every day, every month in this campaign. You know, there's probably going to be other things. Lord knows what's going to happen in either the two wars in the Middle East or in Ukraine. Something could happen, but how can you have more of an October surprise than the July surprise of Biden dropping out of the race? Even though we did predict it.
So we got it half
listens.
right. We got it half right. I guess. I think it's not maybe the magnitude of some, but I actually think Bob Woodward's book War it rises to that level where he's now raised these questions about Trump shipping COVID test kits to Putin, having ongoing conversations with Putin. I thought there would probably be something from the Justice Department, you know, things dropping at the last minute, and there have been some of that. But people have gotten so used to that, it doesn't really break through. But you know, Bob Woodward is out on every station talking about this. He's got Trump on tape at great length. So, and from his past book, so that might be it. But it's. I will say this, and Al knows this so well, that most candidates work for years, and in a way, in a real sense, Kamala Harris has worked for years to rise to the position of vice president, campaigning, but most people have sought the presidency for a number of years. When you get down to the last 20 days, every minute counts. No one on that staff is expected to leave anything on the field, as they say. You are all out. As a matter of fact, I think what I feared the most back in 1988 was that George H.W. Bush would, in fact, leave everything on the field, and we wouldn't get to the last few days because he just wouldn't stop. And the campaign you're doing tracking every night. You're watching your numbers in these close states. You're making decisions really on the run about where to fly. Hopefully you take off and land at the destination you planned, but not always. Sometimes you go somewhere else. It's that kind of pace. And so anything that becomes disruptive in this last 15, 20-day, 10, 5-day sequence can really have an impact. But I think both campaigns are really all out and locked into to kind of this countdown to the election day.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. I mean, in the 2000 campaign, I was on the plane with Senator Lieberman, who's our Democratic vice presidential nominee. And what Craig says is what happened all the time. We'd get up in the air and then something would happen and the Secret Service would be going absolutely bananas. But we say, we got to go someplace else. Because in that case, which was, as it turned out, was as close as this one, it was, we'd go up, I think we were up in the 2nd District of Maine 4 times because of one electoral vote. I mean, and when you're going all out, everything counts, everything matters. I mean, I don't know how George Bush did it, but I know Bill Clinton. He would start at 4 in the morning and go till 2 in the morning, take a shower and get back on. I mean, he used to drive his security people crazy because they couldn't keep up with him.
He lost his voice too, so.
Well, that was a regular thing. Every year in December, he lost his voice because of allergies.
Okay, we got some time. I got to tell one story related to this. So it was not in the last 20 days, but it was the '88 campaign. I was on the plane all the time. And the headquarters calls and says, Bob Teeter, our strategist, pollster, said, look, your guys are in California. You got to extend one more day. We need you one more day in California. And we need an event in Contra Costa County, ideally an education event. And I go, wait. We're in Los Angeles? Okay. You sure that's what you want? He said, yeah. I said, okay, I think we can do it. He goes, well, what do you mean you think we can do it? I said, well, I went to high school in Concord, California, in Contra Costa County, and the principal is a friend of mine. So I get the advanced guys, and I said, you've got to go find Dr. Wetsky. That's his last name. And they said, because we're going to go, tomorrow we're flying to Contra Costa County for an education event. Well, I found him. He was having dinner with my football coach, Dr. Giardina, both of whom, by the way, had retired. But they had kept track of what I was doing, so they said, absolutely, we'll have the whole student body out. We'll be ready to go at 3 o'clock in the afternoon the next day. And the advanced guys said, I think it's going to work. The thing I didn't really think about was what these people were going to do to me. So we always enter through some, back door kind of thing. So that's all worked out with the Secret Service into the gymnasium. We get the motorcade arrives. We get out of the car. The vice president and I are walking down a hallway, and the first wall we come to, I didn't first recognize it because it was a gigantic photograph of me in my high school football uniform. And Bush looks at me like, I don't know. Turn the corner, another picture of me with my letter sweater on. And so we then go out, and they announce Bush, and he walks out and he says, well, that's really a very nice welcome, and I'm really glad to be with you, but I know the person you came to see. He kidded me about this mercifully for, about a month. But the point is, that's how fast you're pulling off events, and you draw upon any resource you can, including your old high school principal.
I was hoping that Al could help. We'd love to take some questions from the audience if we can coordinate that.
I think there's a microphone that can move around.
Raise your hand, I'll come to you. No pressure.
We've got one here already.
I have
Okay, you supervise.
What is your confidence in the polling industry? In 2016, they got it all wrong, right? Have they reformed, if that's the right word? But what's your confidence in the numbers that we're all talking about here tonight?
I think actually the polling, well, first of all, polling is not scientific. There's little art to it. I think in 2016, actually, a lot of the national polls were closer than they get credit for. I mean, the problem is they had Hillary up by 3-4 points. She won by 2.5 in the popular vote, which is what they measure. But what basically the issue is the larger the sample, the better. So national polling is better than state polling. a lot of the state polling isn't really of the great quality anyway, and so that's why you get really nervous when you look at the individual state polls, and obviously a presidential election is decided by who wins in the states. The other thing about polling, and if you're interested, you can search this in the New York Times because it's been in the last 2 weeks. Nate Cohen has this thing a column called The Tilt, and he talked about your question. And why do some polls, for example, have Trump doing a little better, and other polls have Harris doing a little better? It really goes to a couple of things. One is how they weight them. If you assume, because of past elections, that there are 2% more Republicans than Democrats, as opposed to taking what you're getting in the responses where there are 2% more Democrats than Republicans, you get an entirely different outcome. So you got to be careful about who's doing the poll and how they weight it. The other thing, and this is what Nate Cohen wrote about, and it's way beyond my pay grade, I don't quite understand it, but in order to correct for mistakes that were made in previous elections, one of the things that a lot of pollsters are doing is they're asking people how they voted they call it the recall vote, how you voted in the last election, and then use that to weight the results, and that changes it as well. So, the best thing you can do on polling is get as many quality pollsters as you can, and then average them. And you get so if there's an outlier here or there, they sort of get absorbed, and you get a true picture. But it's very hard to do in the swing states. And the other thing that has happened, is that the partisan pollsters understand that these polls are average, so they dump all their partisan polls in that show their candidates doing better, and that also, it makes a difference.
What else? But I would add a couple things. One, I definitely look at the average instead of just any one poll, but a good, responsible average. And then it goes to what Dave asked, which is, I'm always interested in, well, where's the movement? What's the momentum? Is it closing? Is it expanding? And I think the polls are pretty good in determining that. There's no question that Kamala Harris got a huge surge of energy, which there was no possible way it could be sustained after she became the candidate. And then people begin to say, oh my gosh, the momentum is slowing. Well, that was going to happen for sure. But the lines, her lead over Trump's lead, has been pretty consistent for weeks on these polls. The other thing that, and Al is exactly right, it's not a prediction. And they're talking to people who are registered voters. They look at higher propensity voters based on a lot of different factors. But this is a very different race. But the other thing that because I think where the polling, I've always paid close attention to it, has to do with what's on the minds of the voters. Because there you get much bigger breaks. And today, based on, again, on one of these very large surveys, 3,000 people, inflation is what's on people's minds, fairly or unfairly. But that is a real driving force when you go back to that notion, or that my thought that some people feel their life is not working out the way they'd hoped. Huge factor is just the prices of everything. And so while the inflation numbers have been moving in the right direction, and those of us who follow news, think that's terrific, and it is, people are still paying higher prices than they were 3 or 4 years ago. And it's that recollection that causes them to think, well, maybe Trump would do a better job for me. So understanding how important inflation is to voters and how important it is to the voters in some of these really close states is important. Interestingly enough, second was immigration, but it was a big second. And it wasn't, and it was it was a big second. It was second for Republican voters, but even it was quite a ways behind inflation. So and some of the conversation, which I certainly think is important about our democracy and about the nation and our values, those do not register as high in these lists today as you might think. It's definitely a contrast that Kamala Harris is drawing to Trump, but I think her weakness, if there is one, but I think her weakness is getting tagged with having some responsibility for inflation rising and not getting credit for inflation falling, and the economic program of the incumbent. And Al is quite right. Change is a huge factor. I jokingly remind people that I was chief of staff to a sitting vice president who got elected president. There's not a lot of competition for being, one of a kind, because the last chief of staff that did that was the chief of staff to Martin Van Buren. But the reality is, the reason it doesn't happen more often is because by the time somebody's been sitting in the White House for 4 years and certainly for 8 years, those people who are restless, those people who don't feel they're getting kind of a fair shake, they want to change, and that's one of the things she's challenged by.
Let me just make a couple other points about it. Quick.
More questions.
Yeah, okay. On polling, just real quickly, if you took the polling we have now in the 7 swing states, and you adjusted it for the error in those states in the polling in 2020, Trump would win all of them. If you adjusted them for the error we had in the polling in 2022, Harris would win 6 of them. So if somebody tells you that they know how those states are going to be coming out, don't believe them. And the other point Craig made, which is a really important one, or building on what he said, is that when you have a person like Trump who has lost an election, the last weeks of the campaign are really critical. Because, as he said, a lot of people look back nostalgically at how wonderful things were. Well, they really weren't very good. And he got defeated because of the way he handled the pandemic and other things. Well, people in the early parts of the campaign tend to forget those things. But part of the challenge of the Harris campaign is, as we get close to Election Day, is to remind people why they voted Trump out in 2020. And as that happens, incumbent candidates tend to drop. I mean, I remember, some of you may be old enough to remember my first boss, Senator Joe Tidings of Maryland. He had lost in 1970 to Glenn Bell. And he wanted to come back in 1974, and he had a 20-point lead against Paul Sarbanes early in the campaign. And our pollster said, it's got to be 40. We had a June primary. He said, by May 1st, it has to be 40, because you're going to lose almost 40 points when people remember why they voted you out. And sure enough, we had a 20-point lead on May 20th and lost the primary by 20 points.
I'm curious, as we watch in another election and we're all told it's going to come down to these 7 states or these 5 states or these 3 states or it's only Pennsylvania, is there ever going to be a time when we get away from the Electoral College or we have some meaningful change so we feel like we have a say in an election coming from a state where, I don't know what it is, 47 states in the country pretty much know how their state's going to go, and people may feel like their vote's not that important because of that. Any signs or any hope for any meaningful reform there?
I haven't seen a puff of smoke emerging on that one. I don't know. I'll give you my answer, but also broaden a little bit. One of the challenges today is that we do have this division in the country, and it's not just by state. I mean, it's by zip code and neighborhood, and so you have these very safe Republican seats and very safe Democratic seats. You have as the population moves around, it sorts itself out. You look at these maps and, a whole mass of red states and a group of blue states on either coast. It is the way the nation is structured. I personally have thought for a long time, why don't we just count the votes and who wins, wins? On the other hand, and I'm from California, California and New York have big sway because of all the people they have there. Proportionately, they have, more people per electoral vote than they do in North Dakota, South Dakota. And so the wisdom, to the extent there is one, is that you want a president who will really work with all the people across the country, and you don't want states to feel like they're truly left out. Having said that, I really can't imagine that we could go on another decade without this being addressed. Voting, you have half the people vote early. Many of us got our ballots either online or in the mail. We'll vote early. The whole process of counting the votes has become much more, modernized. And so I suspect there'll be an effort to do it. It's just very hard, when you think about it, for the incumbents to push through a change that might threaten them. So, you have a candidate from California and a candidate from Florida. They probably they might see that, well, just going by the majority of voters would be beneficial to us. We'll have to see.
I think there's virtually no chance we're going to get rid of the Electoral College. I mean, think about it. It was a compromise by the Founding Fathers so that the small states would have some say in the election of the president. And the Founding Fathers had a lot of wisdom, but I don't think they were smart enough to understand that in 2024, the largest state in the country, California, was going to have 80 times the population of the smallest state in the country, Wyoming, and that 21 states would add up to a population, the smallest 21 would be less than the population of California. And so basically what's happened, I think, and I wrote a piece for Brookings on this if anybody wants to look for it, is that the institutions of democracy have fallen behind the political and the demographic change in the country. And but there's this small state bias. It's not going to go away because there are more small states, and they're just not going to give up their political power. I've toyed with an idea. If you get somebody like Liz Cheney from Wyoming and Gavin Newsom from California to get together and propose some sort of a deal where you don't eliminate the Electoral College, but you adjust it so that you get 2 more Electoral College votes for every 5 million extra people or whatever it is. It may bring it a little more into balance, but I don't see any chance of the Electoral College being eliminated. But it's a dangerous thing because, you have a situation in the 20th century, we had 25 elections. Every one of them, the popular vote and the electoral vote were the same, and we've had 6 elections here. Twice the person who lost the popular vote won the White House, and Biden won by 7 million votes and came within 45,000 votes of losing the presidency.
No. We're going to take one more question, and then we are all going to go to the new spin room at the Avalon Foundation. It's just where Banning's used to be for a lot more informal questioning of these wonderful folks. Any other questions from the audience?
A question for both of you, kind of a two-parter. If the Democrats lose, do you think the liberal wing of the party will continue to drive their agenda? And if Trump loses, what will be the future of the Republican Party?
Well, that's a good question. So for those of you who know my history, is after Craig and his friends from California and then his new friend from Texas beat our ass 3 elections in a row in the 1980s, I formed this group to deal with the fact that most people thought the Democratic Party had moved too far to the left and had disconnected with the mainstream. And I happened to find this young governor from Arkansas named Bill Clinton, and together we forged an agenda that brought the party back to the center. I think here's the deal. And I think Craig can talk for the Republicans, but I think they have a harder job than we do. Because, you know, if you look at the breakdown of the electorate, 6% of the national electorate and 12% of the Democratic Party are what you call really left-wing progressives. They make more noise, and they tend to dominate the debate. But our theory, when we ran, was that if you rallied the rank and file Democrats who were more moderate and conservative, you could beat the liberals in the primaries. And that's what happened. Just think about what happened in 2020. You know, Joe Biden was not the liberal candidate. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were the candidates everybody had anointed because they were the left of the party. They were the new movement. Well, we got into a race, and rank and file Democrats said, we want to win the White House. We want to get rid of Trump. And after Biden won his first primary victory in South Carolina, he won every other contest except for a firehouse primary in North Dakota, which is not exactly a Democratic state, for the rest of the way. And even in states that he wound up losing because early voting before he won in South Carolina was leaned to Sanders. In those states, he won 2-1 in the vote after South Carolina. So, look, I think what the challenge is for leaders in our party, in my party, to define a centrist agenda, a mainstream agenda, progressive center, progressive left, or center left, which is what we did. And I think you can build a big coalition around it, but you have to have the cojones to basically say, take the heat you're going to get from the people who make the most noise in the party, but it can be done. And if we lose, I think it probably will be done again.
Craig, you have the last word.
Well, you got the last word, but I would say, number one, first of all, very good question. Republicans need to read Al's book. And it will help shape their thinking, our thinking, I'm still a Republican, about what to do next. But I'm optimistic. I'm not optimistic it'll happen fast, but but it might. And the reason the change will occur is that nothing worries a politician, like an elected politician, more than losing. And Donald Trump, whatever happens November 5th, Donald Trump probably wouldn't win the popular vote even if he won the electoral vote this time. He's consistently lost elections. He's driven people out of the party. And so for Republican elected officials, Donald Trump will not be a candidate again after November 5th, one way or another. And they will search for a solution to win. I think Kamala Harris will win, but if that occurs, this might happen faster. And the search will be rapid, and it won't just be the elected officials, it will be the people who fund elections. They don't like to lose either. And I wish there could be some meaningful campaign finance. That's a bigger issue in my mind than the Electoral College, but when you have people putting in $10, $50 million into these super PACs. But anyway, whoever is spending money on the campaigns, whether you like it or not, they don't like to lose. And so the search will go on for finding a path forward which allows Republicans, not just a presidential candidate, but other Republicans to win. I've never thought of the party organization or the party apparatus as being all that significant in that process, and I don't mean to be, blasphemy or anything, but it only happens when there's a leader. I watched it with Ronald Reagan as, a guy in his late 20s, and Ronald Reagan was out giving speeches across the country, and he had this following, and it just kept growing. And the Northeast establishment said, "Oh, you got to be kidding! He's an actor." But he built he built a coalition of supporters from a base of being governor for 8 years of California that helped people believe they could win. And when they heard his message, they thought, I could win. So I do think it'll come back. I don't think it's a party that's destroyed. It's certainly, it's a party that really I don't really recognize in this sense, but I do think when the leadership changes, it'll change. My last comment, but not my last word, is that, first of all, I want to thank the Avalon and the Spy. I really want to thank all of you. I do see familiar faces out there. We kid Al because we say, people stop us at Piazza or they stop us at restaurants or supermarkets and talk about the show. Al doesn't get as much of that, but I really thank you. Not because he's not good, he just doesn't want to live here. I don't know why. So for the people here, for the people who will watch this, thank you for doing this. Dave Whelan came to me over 4 years ago and said, I was having lunch in Annapolis and I met a fellow who says he knows you. His name's Al Fromm. And I said, well, he absolutely does. We've been friends for many years. We've both done presidential transitions. We've both put our heads together on policy questions that trying to find a middle ground. But the truth is, and I think one of the reasons that you watch, and I know many of you say it, is that two people with very different backgrounds, politically and otherwise, can in fact come together once a week and have a civil conversation about the issues that affect us. And for that, Al, I am very grateful, and I'm very grateful to this guy, Dave Whelan, for making it happen every week. Thank you, Dave.
Well, let me just say one more thing.
Always gets the last word.
Thank you for all of you for coming. And Craig, Craig and I came up in an era where, you worked with people of both parties. And in 1992, a week after the election, President-elect Clinton called me and said, I want you to run domestic policy for me in the transition. The first person I called and the most helpful person to me in that whole transition was Craig Fuller, who had led George H.W. Bush's transition 4 years earlier. Because we may have had different points of view, but we both had a central purpose, which was to do what was best for the country. And that's what's missing in our politics today. But it's going to come back. It will come back. Maybe if the Republicans get beat badly, it'll happen to them. If we lose this, maybe we'll have that. But this country has too many good people, and somebody's going to come out and figure out that if you broaden your base and move around across party lines, you can get a hell of a lot more done than you can sitting in your corner screaming and yelling about how bad the other guy is.
Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thank you so much indeed. We will see you in the spin room.